Hello, this is Anthony Effinger. I'm the host of the Think Neuro podcast from Pacific Neuroscience Institute. And today I have Karen Miller. She's a clinical neuropsychologist, and Jennifer Bramen, senior research scientist at the Pacific Neuroscience Institute Foundation. Thank you both for coming on here.
Thank you, Anthony, for having us.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about something very topical today. We're going to talk about mental health during the pandemic, big topic there, and how people should think about re-engaging as the world opens up again, assuming that this time around it really is going to. But first, why don't we get both of you give us a little bit of your background. Maybe start with you, Karen.
Sure. So as a clinical neuropsychologist, I spend part of my time in research looking at various variables such as preclinical markers, who's at risk for depression, who's at risk for cognitive decline. But I also spend a good portion of my time developing programs to create cognitive stimulation. We know that stimulation, no matter what age you are, is really important, but particularly important after the age of 50, because we want to preserve what we have. That use it or lose it phrase really pertains to everyone. And in addition to that, as a clinical neuropsychologist, I do a lot of intakes and evaluations. So I was very privy to the fact that over the pandemic, a lot of people were reporting that they were stuck home alone or with just one or two family members. And there was definitely an increase in loneliness as they had less access to people, classes, clubs, and their regular activities.
Okay, Jennifer.
I am a neuroscientist, so all of my activities are related to research. I primarily do brain imaging work, but I also, because of this really amazing place I work, was able to work closely with Karen Miller and the rest of my team on a cognitive strategies training program to help with managing cognitive impairment. And in my time here, I've worked really hard to develop brain-based biomarkers to understand how different lifestyle factors affect the brain. And I've also worked really hard to help people develop compensatory strategies. So I guess to sum that up and how it's related here, so in developing a lot of compensatory skills, strategies for cognitive impairment, I've just in general taken a great interest in strategic thinking and how you can use that in a really powerful way to operate your brain and meet your maximum potential.
What does your brain imaging studies, what do they tell us about things people might be experiencing during the pandemic?
Your brain definitely responds to stress. So things like stress are going to affect how much gray matter you have. That's where all the cells and synapses that connect your brain, that's where they all live. So these things actually affect like how much brain tissue you have, how many cells you have. They affect the quality of the connections between them. We call that the white matter in the brain. So basically, your brain, it's really, people always say that stress is really important to manage, but what I don't think that they realize is things like having a healthy lifestyle, taking care of yourself, exercising, managing your stress, sleeping really affects the amount of brain tissue you have and the quality of the brain tissue you have.
That's incredible that it's that cut and dried.
I think my approach is often rooted in the cells, but yeah, I think it's really hard to argue with biology.
Is it fair to say that Jennifer, you're more in the research in the lab, and Karen, you're more in the clinic?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Absolutely.
But you're both after the same thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, even in the clinic, we're invested in research, right? Because one, that's sometimes where you collect the research, right? When you work with a neuroscientist, but also we want to be informed by research as to what else to provide next in the clinic, right? Or if we've created something that we think is a clinical tool, we ideally want to research it pre and post. So like Jennifer, is describing something that she's created, which is pretty incredible. So when she first started creating this cognitive stimulation program that actually is used in conjunction with exercise on a stationary bike, she and I met, and I talked to her about the various programs that I had developed for what we call in the classroom, where an actual trainer or teacher teaches 5 or 20 people. And so we went through all those various exercises that we know work, right? We have 40, 50 years of psychology research behind these particular techniques. So she wanted to see, okay, what works in the classroom? How do I then translate that to a more of a computer-based platform so that someone could do this individually in their own home, the comfort of their own home, while riding a bike?
Okay, let's talk. Jennifer, describe that program.
That program is called MSIM. It is a mobile web app that is designed, as Karen says, to be used simultaneously while people do aerobic activity. I'll talk about the app first. So so mental stimulation in general is incredibly important for your brain, and they show that people that are more cognitively stimulated have less decline over time as they age. And that, things like when people retire can often be a time of steep decline.
Yes.
So just like times, and we'll talk about this later, when you might have a really big tail off or fall off of social activity, which is also cognitively stimulating. It stimulates your brain. Those fall offs really do mean fall offs in your biology too, and in your functionality. So there are people are trying to develop more and more computerized ways of stimulating the brain, because it's great to be able to go to a place where there's a lot of people or to take classes, but it would be great if you could also do it for half an hour here and there without the assistance of somebody as esteemed as Karen Miller. But some of the brain training apps that are out there, they stimulate the brain. They might even you might even see changes in gray matter, which is, I told you, where the cells live. But the other piece of this is you want those to be the parts of the brain you use when you do real life activities. So sometimes playing games might give you more brain tissue, but sometimes that may or may not actually generalize to something that you would use to, remember where your glasses are, for example.
Okay.
So the point when we started developing this program, MSIM, really like the big head scratcher was, how do we do something that, will stimulate the parts of the brain that actually perform real life tasks? So we created strategies, and then we also did a lot of simulations, a lot of activities to sort of simulate role play, applying those strategies on the tablet, but in a simulated real life sort of environment. Does that make sense? So
yeah,
people would practice strategies.
You're doing this on an exercise bike?
And then that's the other piece. So you're doing it on an exercise bike. That was challenging. I will say that. But the reason is that when you do aerobic exercise, you get sort of this bath of really important hormones, like neurotropic factors like BDNF. You get you lose a lot of maybe inflammatory waste products. You get a lot of blood supply and oxygen. So your cells are, maybe plumper, more juicy, more, healthy. And
wait, what's the word you used? You said neurotropic, right?
Perfect. Yes.
What's that mean?
So a neurotropic factor is something that can help create new cells.
Okay.
The key is those new connections, right? So games that are then creating and actually reflecting real life skills, and like how Jennifer talked about white matter and gray matter. We're looking at, when she said plumper, that's such a great word, right? Because we're actually looking to see, are there more connections, right? So can you actually, let's say, problem solve in more than one way, rather than just thinking in a linear fashion, by doing these exercises and improving your skill set or your cognitive flexibility, for example.
Okay, so doing these exercises in this environment of exercise, where all these good changes are happening to your brain is a winner.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that yet. We're currently collecting data to find that out. But we are building on a study that this team did at UCLA prior to this, where they had a proctored exam. They had an instructor teach while they were on the bike, and that did seem to benefit more than brain stimulation and exercise alone.
That's
looking at the synergy, right? We know the research shows exercise is good for your brain. We know the research shows cognitive training is good for your brain. So Jennifer is looking to see what's the synergy. Maybe it's more than a double effect, or certainly more than one or alone.
interesting.
Like additive.
Interesting. Sure. Okay, so Karen, how are you involved in this research?
Well, I met with Jennifer in the beginning because I wanted to go over some of the different types of cognitive exercises, particularly what we call short-term memory learning, because one of the areas that declines or changes in everyone, even if they're a superstar, is that there is some short-term memory loss. And that means that it's harder to encode new information, hold on to the new information, and then later recall the new information. And so some of the exercises that Jennifer wanted to develop was focused on the short-term memory piece, in addition to language, executive functioning, processing speed. And so she and I met because there are certain core memory techniques that are tried and true. And so for an example, the majority of us learn better in a contextual format, which means if I told you a story, Anthony, about my trip to Alaska, you'd be more likely to remember that information about me versus if I just told you 5 bullet points.
Mm-hmm.
You would forget that right away. In fact, I'd probably just bore you if I told you 5 bullet points and you would tune me out. But if I told you a short, interesting story, you'd be more likely to remember that about me.
Interesting. Okay. So you all teamed up on this.
Yeah.
To design this. On that contextual learning side question, I very often will forget somebody's name when I meet them, but I rarely forget where they're from. Am I putting is that because where they're from is in the context of the map and the globe?
Exactly. And so that interests you. Like for me, when I meet a new patient or client, I always ask what their profession is because I'm highly interested in professions.
Mm-hmm.
And that often gives me the context of their story.
Yes.
Right. And then I also can then start to fill in some details, right? Like, so if they're an aerospace engineer, right, I start to think, oh, what project have they worked on? And how many years of schooling did they go to? And how many different companies have they worked for? All these other questions, because then I think of it as I'm building a file, I'm building their storyline. You can think about it in terms of the industry, we're building their script, right? Their character.
Right. Okay.
But where they're from is one of those contextual details. Like that's probably more interesting to you than, their shoe size.
Yeah. And names are random in a way. Right.
Names are the hardest, actually.
Yeah. There's no
training. We teach a story method, which is contextual learning to the name. So, like, for example, when Jennifer and I first met you, right, we had to think, okay, how are we going to memorize this guy's name is Anthony? We actually went back and forth privately about it. But in my mind, I filed you away as an Anthony because both my husband and my son's middle name was Anthony.
Perfect.
So I just linked it to that.
Interesting. Okay. Right. So Jennifer, how does brain imaging play into this study that you're doing? Are you imaging people's brains as they're working on this app on the bike, or?
No, but I do it before and after.
You do?
We are imaging before and after to see. So the stage right now is very early piloting and just trying to see if there's any research backing that it's effective. And one of the outcome measures we have is structural imaging. Another one is functional imaging. We have measures of blood perfusion. So we have measures of white matter integrity. So we really want to see if over it's a 12-week program. If that time during that time, people might see a boost in any of these.
Got it. Where are we in the 12 weeks? Or
the study itself will probably take another year to finish enrolling, and probably another 6 months after that to complete. So it takes a while to finish this stuff.
Oh yeah, sir. I know these things take a long time, and I know that even when they're done, that good researchers are always very cautious about talking about the results until everything is
But Jennifer's studying an important population. So these are individuals who are experiencing some type of mild cognitive change.
Okay.
Right? And so that's a very, very important population in the field of neuroscience and neuropsychology, because they're essentially the most vulnerable. These are not people who have dementia, but these people are not people, correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer, are not people who are perfectly fine. So they have some mild cognitive issues. So this is the most vulnerable population, but also the most eager population to actually get to work, and where we actually have the chance in science to see a difference.
Okay, so Jennifer, what kind of cognitive impairments are we talking about?
We make sure that everybody in this particular population has what's called amnestic impairments, which means they have issues with their episodic memory. So they might have other types of cognitive impairments. Most people don't just have one, but all of them have to be impaired in actual memory. And
what does episodic memory mean?
Sure. So there's a couple of different kinds of memory. One of them is episodic memory. So that's like your ability to remember you actually learned something. And then the others is more like skills learning. Like you could learn how to tie a new knot, and have no ability to remember that you learned how to tie that knot. And you would still know how to tie the knot, but you might not remember that somebody taught you to tie the knot. Does that make sense? So you have like motor memory.
Okay.
Driving a car, you could completely forget that somebody ever taught you to drive a car, but you would still know how to drive a car. They're different.
Okay.
They're different parts of the brain that cover.
Like think of it as like what you might learn from your history teacher versus learning to ride a bicycle. So if you forget what your history teacher taught you, you're forgetting that episodic information. But if you still know how to ride a bicycle, then you have that procedural memory. But you may not remember that your dad or your uncle taught you to ride the bicycle.
Okay.
What city or town you were in when you learned to ride the bicycle.
Yeah. Okay, great.
And the most type of forgetting that occurs with aging after age 50 is episodic.
I believe it.
People forget new information, right? That's why people struggle with a new computer or a new cell phone or a new TV remote control, because they have a hard time remembering new information.
Right. And that's
I have a tip for that.
What?
So, if when somebody teaches you something, because your episodic memory isn't as good, I wouldn't expect, honestly, in my age, I no longer expect that I'm just going to remember that like and replaying a movie. I would practice several times, because when you practice something over and over again, you use different parts of your brain, like your basal ganglia, like your cerebellum. Those things last longer. One of the earliest areas in the brain to start showing signs of decline is called your medial temporal lobe. And it's also famous for something called the hippocampus. I think people hear about that a lot. So that area is just a little bit more sensitive to aging. So I think it's really important as we get older to lean into the things that we're better at. So I highly recommend, as you get older and older, that everybody be thinking more and more how you can use habit learning, skill learning, procedural learning, things that just require repetition and are sort of the things that after you do them 20 times, you don't even remember that you're doing them. You don't even have to think about them, because those parts of your brain are still around.
Okay, and after the repetition, Jennifer's famous for saying, then teach someone to do it. Right?
Oh, right.
Also, then you are applying what you know.
So is this an example? So my mother, she's 96. We had to get her a new phone. It no longer has a button that you push to get back to the home screen. You have to slide up.
Yeah.
Totally messing her up.
Yes.
Should she just practice over and over sliding that thing up?
She should just deliberately practice sliding it up. And honestly, if she did it for an hour, like half an hour.
And even better, tell her that part where you slide up is just like the button.
Right.
If you tell her it's just invisible, The button's invisible, and instead of pushing, you push up.
Okay,
Then you'll be able to link it to the old information.
so the bottom line is, don't be afraid as you get older to, say, I'm going to do this over and over so I get it.
Correct.
Whatever it is.
And to learn new things.
Right.
And then to have repetition.
Things. We're gonna talk a little bit more about brain stimulation, and there's so many different kinds, but you really always want to be challenging yourself and honestly doing the things that are hard for you. Not your brain as you get older wants to become more and more efficient, so it wants to get rid of the parts of your brain you're not using. Because why maintain it? You're not using it, right?
You want to do something novel that is challenging but not stressful. So there's a sweet spot. Okay, so a new cell phone is a really good example, because for most people, a new cell phone is stressful. So in order to get the sweet spot, you have to link what they're doing on the new phone to what they used to do on the old phone. Therefore, you're getting the challenge, but not the stress.
And now a message from our sponsor. The Think Neuro podcast is brought to you by Pacific Neuroscience Institute Foundation, a nonprofit 501c3 organization. If you're inspired by what you hear and wish to support our mission of education through innovation, please visit pacificneuro.org/foundation.
So my husband loves tech. He's in tech. He's a developer. He was a developer. Now he's like management developers, but he always wants to get a new phone. He loves learning to use them. And I used to like learning new stuff, but eventually I have like 10 phones worth of information in my head. So, and at one point I switched from an iPhone to a Samsung, and I just kept wanting to throw my phone. I just was so excited. Never did what I wanted. Nothing was where I expected it to be. That was a terrible experience. And what I learned next time was when I switched to like my next new phone is I take a few weeks before I start using my new phone. Because you usually have a little time, you could set up your phone and just practice with it so that when you're actually day-to-day life,
that is a great tip.
It's stressful because you want to do something and this phone is between you and the action you need to take that you're in a hurry to take. And nobody does well under time pressure. It's just stressful.
That's a great tip, Jennifer.
But are you saying hang on to your old phone and use that as your operating sort of?
No, just to use it, that you have it as your crutch for a week or two. And then turn it in. So I actually did something similar to Jennifer, but instead I made sure that my son got a brand new phone like myself. So that, of course, he, in less than 1 hour, was able to do every single function.
Yeah.
So now I had a built-in tutor starting hour 1.
Yeah,
So
smart.
If you have one, you definitely.
Yeah. And then I learned it really fast. All of a sudden I realized this isn't stressful. This is actually super fun and way more useful. But see, your mom at 96 doesn't have a 16-year-old sitting by her. So you have to link the current functions to the old functions.
I wish we'd had this conversation a week ago.
Well, it's still relevant, probably.
Yeah, no, I can.
Probably still stressed out about that home button.
I'm sure. So, okay. Stimulation, doing things that are challenging but not too difficult. What has happened over the last, what year are we in now? 3 of this pandemic?
2020 part 3.
Yeah. So I'm thinking stimulation has probably gone way down.
I think for a lot of people it has. I mean, I think people feel more maybe over agitated but that's not the same thing as really being stimulated. A lot of people aren't engaging in the same level of social activities that they used to.
They feel out of practice, to tell you the truth. They feel out of practice. Like, hey, I used to do something every Saturday night and on Wednesdays with my friends, and now they're out of practice. And how do you jump back into that? How do you get back into a more regular schedule?
You hear this with students. I hear this with students. They're out of practice being in classroom situations, lunchroom situations, social situations. There's no reason that would be any different for adults. It would just probably be more detrimental to kids, right?
Well, I mean, maybe in the short term, they're maybe actually experiencing a higher degree of anxiety that's visible. But
Yeah.
even lately on the news, they've been talking about return to work, and people are having a lot of sleep difficulties, even thinking about going back into the workforce in person.
Mm.
Right? It's
Mhm.
almost like they're out of practice of actually going to their office or their cubicle.
Interesting. Okay, so what can people do?
I feel like there's a couple of sort of buckets that we can discuss, and one of those it just goes back to the cell phone thing. There are a lot of just giving yourself the time and space to practice. I think there's an expectation that what I find is that people feel like skills are like this hill you climb, and you just get to a certain level and it's like always there, and they're not really comfortable being a learner again if they feel like they're expert. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that maybe it's going to be a little awkward and it might just take a few weeks for you to get back in the swing of things. There's all kinds of body language to get used to. There's all kinds of different personalities. There's a lot of things that people just haven't had to think about for the last few years. But I think putting a more positive, the other bucket is, there's like the patience bucket. I think that's bucket one. And then the second bucket is realizing how important it is for you and making it something positive. Like I think most people don't realize how important social activity in all of those millions of ways that a social situation requires your brain, how important that is for your brain health. And also, honestly, we're dominant in this world because we're smart, but also because of our civilization, right? We are hardwired. We are hardwired to be social. We are not meant to be all by ourselves all the time. And we're not meant to be, in these small, repetitive worlds where you don't have to think about it anymore. So I think
that's really important what Jennifer's saying. As you're saying that, Jennifer, I was thinking actually going and being with our friends or family in person is a much more of a whole brain workout than meeting on Zoom or texting or calling on the phone. Because it's, if we call or Zoom, we are really engaging our verbal skills and somewhat visual, because we're looking at you, Anthony, we're trying to read, are you happy today or not? But it's totally different than if we're in person. There's so many executive functioning frontal lobe steps that are involved, even just meeting at the restaurant or meeting at your friend's condo, and then, deciding, what are we going to talk about? What are we going to eat? What are we going to do next? How far apart do we sit? What do we share? What do we wear? All those are executive skills that we are not engaging when we're just calling someone, when we're just Zooming with someone, and certainly not if we're just texting.
Yes, right. And in that sense, texting is this such a truncated, impoverished form of interaction.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like a telegraph.
Yeah. I mean, you're getting nothing in terms of cues. Okay. So a lot of us have been without this for, year 3 now. So you're saying, take your time, recognize that this could be a little hard to get back into it.
Think about planning ahead. Like one of the things that helps is like thinking about what would be important, for return to work or return to socializing. And then they say to visualize, like actually take your brain through like the movie of what will it look like? If I meet my friend at the restaurant, or if I go back to my office or my cubicle, what will that visually look like? What do I think that will feel like? So kind of like, I like to think about it like how you might prepare your child for the first day of school, like walk through all the information.
Yeah.
So you feel a little more prepared for the moment.
Yeah. That's funny. I used to ski race in college, and we used to visualize being on the course.
Yes.
I mean, who thought that going out to dinner would require the same kind of visualization?
But that's such a great example of being on the course, because especially if you're, a new skier or a mediocre skier, the most important thing you do when you get to the ski slope is look at the map, right?
Yeah.
You want to know where should you go and what should you avoid, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you're an expert skier, like, high school, college, professional level, even more important to know the course.
Yeah.
It's that visual piece.
So, maybe we should have started with this before we talk about how to recover, but what do you think, how bad was the pandemic for people's mental health in terms of stimulation and socialization?
I feel, to me, it's unknowable. I mean, I think, yes, I mean, like you, I've read a lot of articles that there's obviously much higher incidence of depression and anxiety in general in all age groups than there was before the pandemic. But the true cost of it is probably not what's happening immediately. The true cost is what's going to happen. What are people going to carry with them going forward? And we don't know that. People can also be really resilient and bounce back. And if the thing that, so I think it's yet to be seen. I think it's up to us to start trying to prioritize that, though, more, because this has increasingly become endemic. So I think learning that our mental health, our ability to socialize, maybe we can't socialize with hundreds of people in a week like we used to, but to really hone in on those really satisfying relationships that really give you that warm and fuzzy feeling, those people that really matter to you in life, and just picking those things that really matter and prioritizing mental health. You're not just surviving, I think, anymore. I think that's the thing, is like, we need to all get around the idea that we want to carry our brain for decades.
And I think Jennifer's right. I think we're not even going to know the toll. And I think part of the predictive variables will be how vulnerable were you before or during the start of the pandemic. And what I mean by that is there are some people who were set up even more vulnerable than others. So for example, if you were living in a retirement home and you had, all of a sudden it was on lockdown and you had no access to people, and the only access you had now was the phone and Zoom because they have all these rules in place. This is true for retirement homes, for assisted living, or let's say you sheltered in place with your spouse who's 10 years older than you and they already have a serious cognitive impairment. And all of a sudden your only stimulation is the TV and your cognitively impaired spouse. And you no longer go to the temple or church or the golf club or bridge club. All of a sudden, like, your ability to be cognitively stimulated daily for an hour to 3 hours a day just decreased to about 15 minutes for the day. So that's the type of person who's really vulnerable 2 years out, 3 years out from the pandemic, for in fact developing serious cognitive decline, in addition to depression.
Wow.
Karen, can I ask you a question? I know I'm not the interviewer. I'm not supposed to be asking.
No, please.
No.
But I'm really curious. What are your thoughts on reading, like reading fiction, and its ability? I really don't know the answer to this. And its ability.
Reading, I think, is very important. Actually, when we do a clinical intake, one of the questions we ask about for both attention and memory is, do you read magazines or books, or do you just watch the news or TV shows? And the reason why reading is really important is that it requires actually active short-term memory engagement, because you have to remember the characters, the setting, and then you also have to catch on to the inferences, like how do they feel or what's going to happen next, right? So reading is really critical to that cognitive engagement. And what's very fascinating, as people begin to develop more serious cognitive impairment, they're reading, the time they spend in reading, if they were an avid reader, the time they spend in reading goes down. And it's because they have a harder time tracking the stories. And one of the interventions I give people is, if they love to read, but they're having a harder time with reading, is to actually have a spiral notebook. And after every chapter, to write down the main characters' names and something important that happened in that chapter, because then they're actively reviewing what's going on in the book. And then they're able to track the characters more clearly. So reading is a key, I think, cognitive stimulation. And it's also, though, a very important sign of when somebody's declining. Now, some people are never readers, right? They're very visually based, and that doesn't mean that they have cognitive impairment. But the avid readers who stop reading, it's usually due to cognitive decline.
That's interesting. I can picture myself in some of that. I'm like, how much do I remember of what I read? I would follow up with that question and ask, what about like Netflix? Is that a valid form of stimulation and engagement or not? Watching these series,
I mean, I haven't ever seen a paper say that the amount of time you watch TV is in some way related to some brain health benefit. Have you, Karen?
No, I would say the only way TV is beneficial is if you turn it into a social activity. So if you actually are watching with a family member or a friend, and then you're discussing them in the context as if they're, a story.
Yeah.
Right. And like some people can really binge watch and really get into certain series. And then you actually do like a character analysis, and that person you might talk to, your family member as if that character is also a friend. Right. Then there's a stimulation piece. Right.
Okay.
Not an activity. So what I'm hearing is, if it's just
just solo binge watching.
Passive viewing is not really engaging in the same way. I mean, sometimes that's fine. I think there's nothing wrong with, at the end of the day,
right, with downtime.
And stop thinking about all of these things. But it's not really necessarily going to be a workout. Like watching people work out isn't as good as working out.
Right, there you go.
Exactly. Right. Don't on YouTube, don't watch people build Legos. You should actually build them. That's a whole better for your parietal lobe.
Well, and a lot of kids these days don't actually even play video games anymore. They watch other people play video games.
Right. Which,
how could it possibly have gotten worse? And it did.
It's not the same because, they say the best surgeons are actually the ones who play video games, but I'm pretty sure they don't say the best surgeons are the ones that watch YouTube watching video games.
No.
Because that hand-eye coordination is important. And video games do have a place for some of that.
Certainly.
Yeah.
I would tell people that they shouldn't have pastimes. I think that there's nothing wrong with that. It's more like, it's also important to know that much like your body needs exercise, your brain needs exercise. And it's sometimes you need to do things that are a little bit more challenging. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. We're talking about social stimulation and returning to a lot of social activities that require a lot more problem solving and planning and nuance. But there's other categories of things we talked about. Reading, it could be cooking a new recipe.
Gardening
Is really good mental stimulation.
Absolutely.
Requires a lot of problem solving.
I'm a big gardener, and I think it's going to be the thing that keeps me, from going completely off the rails in old age. I'm counting on it.
I'm a cook. I'm a terrible gardener. I'm a plant killer.
So is my wife.
Homicidal to plants. I don't mean to be.
Yeah, no, it happens.
But cooking is a really good example that requires significant executive skills and memory. Yeah. I struggle
with cooking, and it is a mental, it's a mental test for me. I always lose track of where I am in the recipe. I have to kind of keep track. I find it to be a super good, exercise. Absolutely.
And the ultimate multitasking test is cooking and cleaning up at the same time.
Yeah. You mean clean?
If you ever notice really good cooks, a lot of times they don't have the skills to also clean up. Right. So if you really think about from a neuroscience standpoint, I've been studying this during the pandemic, who can cook, who can learn to cook, but also who can clean up. Because it's a different skill set, but it's still all frontal lobes.
And you're not kidding about that.
No, I mean, okay. I'm studying as in studying people in my practice, in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I range out both. How good of a cook are you, and how good of a cook and a cleaner-upper?
I was traditionally the cook who left a wake of mess behind me. But then I learned to take time at the beginning of planning a meal to actually plan in stopping points.
Yes.
Actually plan in stopping points where I can catch up to everything and lay my stuff out again.
That's why Jennifer has a PhD in neuroscience and most people don't, because she figured it out.
And you're making your husband probably a lot happier that you're doing that.
I am, but he cooks with me, so it's
Okay. Well, I'm the guy who cleans up, and yeah.
but he was actually the one that wanted more of a scaled approach, because it makes it a lot easier for us to work cooperatively also. Because if I'm just trying to figure it out like every 5 minutes.
When you're done enjoying the meal, it is more enjoyable if half the cleanup is done.
Yeah. Last thing, I don't think I'm alone in this, but it feels like during this pandemic, a lot of people have gotten more interested in puzzles. Like I started doing crosswords. We all know Wordle's huge. There's just puzzle issues in the New Yorker, the New York Times. This has got to be good, right?
It is.
Okay.
There's actually some research that shows, so it's not always directly linked to puzzles per se, but the cognitive stimulation of doing something that is challenging or slightly increasing in its challenge, including puzzles, is good for the brain.
Yeah. Okay. But it sounds like we should be doing them on exercise bikes.
TBD, we're still studying the effects of that, but it couldn't hurt.
Okay. All right. Well, listen,
As long as you're safe.
As long as you're safe, yeah. As long as you're not doing it on your actual bike in the street.
Correct.
Stationary bike.
Exactly.
Stationary bike.
Don't try this at home.
Right. We don't want to be responsible.
Stationary bike.
Try this at home. Don't on your stationary bike.
Right.
Don't try it on the street.
No traumatic brain injuries, no broken hips. That's our goal.
Okay. Well, we'll have you all on again, and we're going to hear more about this study as it goes forward. And I know you've got some other stuff we want to talk about. So we'll get with you two again. It's been wonderful to talk with you, and I think people will find this useful. I hope they do.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
It's been a lot of fun.